Your front door is not as safe as you think. There's a moment, just a split second, right before your key slides into the lock when you are the most vulnerable you will ever be outside your own home. You're tired. You're distracted. Maybe you're juggling groceries, talking on the phone, or trying to keep your kid from running into the street. Your guard is completely down because you're home. You made it. You're safe, except you're not. And the terrifying part? You'll never know just how close to danger you came, unless you have a camera. Welcome to one of the most disturbing compilations we've put together. What you're about to read is not fiction. These are real events captured by real home security cameras across the United States. Some of these stories ended okay. Others didn't end as cleanly. And at least one of them will make you check every lock in your house before you go to sleep tonight. Let's start with the one that will hit closest to home. Literally. The woman who almost didn't make it. It was a normal Tuesday afternoon in a quiet residential neighborhood outside of Charlotte, North Carolina. The kind of street where kids ride bikes and neighbors wave from driveways. The kind of place where nothing bad is supposed to happen. A young mother, we'll call her Dana, was walking home from her car with her 8-month-old daughter cradled against her chest. She'd just come back from the pediatrician, and her mind was somewhere between the doctor's advice about sleep schedules and whether she had anything thawed for dinner. She had no idea that 40 feet behind her, a man had been following her for the last 2 blocks. The security camera mounted above her front door caught everything. As Dana makes her way up the driveway, you can see the man in the background walking at a measured pace, not too fast, not too slow. Controlled, deliberate. But then something changes. About 20 feet from her porch, he reaches up and pulls a mask over his face. Let that sink in for a moment. It's broad daylight, on a residential street. And this man is pulling up a mask, not because of illness, not because of the cold, but to conceal his identity. To make sure that when the worst happened, nobody would be able to identify him afterward. Dana's daughter, still nestled against her shoulder, turned her tiny head toward the man. Babies notice things adults miss. They pick up on movement, on energy, on things that don't belong. But Dana didn't see her daughter look. She was already at the door, shifting her baby to one arm, fumbling with her keys. The man was now at the bottom of her porch steps. What happened next came down to a matter of seconds. Dana got the door open, stepped inside, and swung it shut behind her. The latch clicked just as the man's foot hit the top step. She had made it inside by what can only be described as a miracle of timing. Dana didn't know what had almost happened. Not yet. It wasn't until her husband reviewed the footage that evening that the full horror of it came into focus. She watched the video 3 times, each time her hands shaking a little more. On the 3rd viewing, she picked up the phone and called the police. What the responding officer told her was the kind of information that changes how you move through the world. There had been a series of violent attacks on women in the greater Charlotte area over the previous several weeks, all with the same disturbing pattern. The attacker followed his victims from public spaces, waited until they were at their most distracted, entering their homes, loading their cars, walking from parking lots, and struck when they were within feet of safety. The detective who reviewed Dana's footage was blunt. The behavior on tape, the deliberate pace, the mask, the targeting of a woman with an infant was consistent with every other case in their file. Dana and her daughter had come within seconds of becoming another entry in that file. She shared the footage publicly, not for attention, but with a message. Please look behind you before you open your door. That 1 extra second of awareness is all it might take. And if you have a camera, check it regularly. You might see something you were never meant to see. The suspect in the footage was never conclusively identified. As of the time of this writing, the case remains open. 2 men, $1, and a lot of unanswered questions. Not every threatening situation comes wrapped in obvious evil. Sometimes the scariest videos are the ones where you're left genuinely uncertain about what you just watched. And that uncertainty keeps you up at night longer than anything else. This next video was submitted anonymously by a college student in Columbus, Ohio. She'd just returned to her apartment after an evening class and let herself in through her ground floor unit. She was barely inside, barely as in the door had just clicked shut, when 2 men appeared at her front door. The camera caught everything. The first man, tall, dark jacket, hood up, didn't knock. He didn't ring the bell. He grabbed the door handle and tried to push his way in. Just like that. No hesitation, no announcement. He simply tried to open the door as if he had every right to do so. The door, thankfully, had locked automatically behind the girl. The man tried the handle once more, and then turned to look back at the second man behind him. There's a pause, just a second or two. And then the first man looks directly into the camera lens. What happens next is where things get complicated. Rather than leaving, the first man knocks, politely, as if he's a guest who simply forgot to announce himself. His whole demeanor changes, the aggressive handle jiggling replaced by what almost looks like casual friendliness. He leans casually against the doorframe. He looks at the camera again. From inside, you can hear the student screaming. Not screaming for help. Screaming at the men, her voice raw with panic. "Get away from my door. I'm calling 911. I'm calling 911 right now." The 2 men don't run immediately. They linger. And then, only after she screams, "I'm calling the police," do they finally jog off down the street. Now, here's where the online discussion around this video gets divisive. Some viewers, having watched it dozens of times, believe the men genuinely had the wrong address, confused maybe, or under the influence of something, and the whole thing was a clumsy misunderstanding. They point to the fact that the men stuck around and knocked rather than running immediately, suggesting they weren't acting like people who knew they'd been caught. But others, including several people who describe themselves as criminal justice professionals in the comments, pointed out something more chilling. The gap between when the girl entered the apartment and when the men appeared at the door was less than 5 seconds. If you're walking up to an address and you genuinely aren't sure someone is home, you don't try the handle before you knock. And if you realize you have the wrong house, you leave. You don't stay and knock while a woman screams at you from the other side of the door. There's also the moment when the first man glances at the camera mid-interaction. Was he checking to see how well-positioned the camera was? Was he making a mental note of what had been captured? Or was it just a nervous, innocent look? No one has a definitive answer. The student filed a police report, but no charges were ever filed. The case, as far as anyone knows, has never been resolved. And maybe that's the most unsettling thing about it. You watch it and you never quite know. You just know that if that door hadn't locked automatically, everything would have been different. The casino night that almost became a nightmare. For married couple Marcus and Renee, the night had started beautifully. They'd driven to a riverboat casino about 40 minutes outside of their home in Tacoma, Washington. Something they did maybe 4 or 5 times a year. They had dinner, played a few hours of blackjack and slots, and walked out of there with a solid $300 more than they'd walked in with. They were in a great mood on the drive home, laughing, talking about what they'd spend the winnings on. "Maybe a weekend away," Renee said. "A nice dinner at minimum," Marcus countered. They pulled into their driveway a little after 2 a.m., perfectly happy and completely unaware that two men had been following them from the casino parking garage. Marcus got out first and walked up to the front door, starting to unlock it. Renee was a few steps behind him, still smiling at something he'd said. Then she heard footsteps. She turned around and the world stopped making sense for a second. A young man, hoodie, dark pants, was running towards her across the lawn. And in his right hand, catching the yellow light from the porch lamp, was a gun. Renee moved on pure instinct. She bolted for the door, shoved past Marcus and slammed it behind both of them. Marcus threw the deadbolt. On the other side of the door, they could hear the man outside. A few seconds later, there was a sharp, metallic bang, then another, then another. The man was pistol whipping their security camera, trying to destroy the evidence. Marcus called 911 while Renee kept the lights off and her back against the wall. When she checked the front-facing camera app on her phone, she could see not one, but two men on their porch. The second man had hung back in the shadows, a lookout, or simply waiting to see how things played out. Police arrived within 8 minutes. The suspects had fled, but not before the camera captured clean footage of both of their faces. The primary suspect, identified through the footage and a tip line, was an 18-year-old from the South Tacoma area. He was arrested 9 days after the incident and charged with first-degree attempted robbery, assault with a deadly weapon, and criminal mischief for destroying the camera. He pleaded not guilty to all charges. Renee, in a local news interview that went briefly viral, said something that stuck with people. "That camera saved our lives twice. Once because we made it inside, and once because it made sure he didn't get away with it." The second suspect was arrested 3 weeks later. Renee now keeps the porch light on all night. Inside the house, when the danger is already there. Everything in Part 1 happened at the threshold, that terrifying border between outside and inside, danger and safety. But what happens when that line has already been crossed? What happens when the thing you're afraid of isn't waiting at your door because it's already inside? This section is harder to write. It's harder to read because these aren't near misses caught in the nick of time. These are violations of space, of safety, of the primal understanding that your home is the one place you should be able to rest without fear. The pantry that opened itself. Before we go to the darkest place, let's start somewhere in the gray zone, the place between the explainable and the deeply, deeply unsettling. Jake, a 29-year-old freelance graphic designer from Portland, Oregon, had a habit of falling asleep on his couch on weekend nights. He lived alone in a ground-floor apartment, kept his doors locked, and had installed an indoor camera mostly as a joke. He'd seen a few ghost hunting videos online and figured he'd capture some dust particles and call it content. What he captured instead, on a Saturday night in late March, was something that made him seriously reconsider his living situation. At 1:39 in the morning, his camera motion alert woke him from a light sleep. He groaned, assumed it was the cat, except he didn't have a cat, and rolled over. The pantry doors across the room were open, both of them, swung wide, as if someone had pushed them from the inside. Jake had a ceiling fan running. He told himself it was a draft. He told himself this despite the fact that the pantry is on the interior wall of the apartment, nowhere near a window or vent. He told himself what people tell themselves at 1:39 in the morning when they live alone and don't want to deal with whatever is actually happening. He closed his eyes. 4 minutes later, at 1:43 a.m., one of the pantry doors slammed shut, not swung, not drifted, slammed. The kind of aggressive, deliberate motion that communicates intent. The kind that answers your question about whether this is just a draft with an emphatic, bone-cold no. Jake posted the footage the next morning, and it racked up over 2 million views in 48 hours. The comment section was split almost exactly down the middle between people with rational explanations, temperature differentials, wood expansion, air pressure from the HVAC system, and people who simply wrote things like, "Move immediately" and "Do not stay there." Jake, to his credit, tried to reproduce the event scientifically. He ran the same fan at the same settings. He checked for drafts, for pressure fluctuations, for anything that could explain both the opening and the violent slamming, because those two things in sequence are what makes it impossible to rationalize away. He never found a satisfying explanation. He moved out 4 months later, citing unrelated reasons. The footage, however, remains. The boy who watched her sleep. This is the one. If you've been reading casually up to this point, stop. Pay attention. Because this story is about a real 15-year-old girl in a real city in the American heartland, and what happened to her in her own bedroom is the kind of thing that redefines the word violation. The Holloway family lived in a mid-sized house in a suburb just outside of Wichita, Kansas. Mom, Angela, was raising her 2 daughters, 15-year-old Zoe and her 2-year-old sister Maya, largely on her own. Their house had a security camera system that Angela had set up after a string of break-ins in the neighborhood the previous summer. On a Friday night in mid-autumn, Zoe went to bed around 11, earbuds in, phone on the nightstand. Normal. Routine. Sometime around 2:30 in the morning, the camera in the hallway began recording. The footage shows a teenage boy, slight build, dark clothes, moving through the house with a kind of awful confidence. He hadn't broken in. The front door had simply been unlocked, left that way by accident, the way front doors sometimes are when you live in a neighborhood that has always felt safe. He walked through the living room. He checked the kitchen, and then he walked down the hallway and into Zoe's bedroom. He stood over her while she slept. The camera in her room caught him there, just standing, watching for what the timestamp shows was nearly 4 minutes. Zoe opened her eyes. She described it later in an interview as the most purely terrifying moment of her life. Not an exaggeration, not a dramatic turn of phrase, but a clinical statement of fact. She woke up to find a stranger she had never seen before, standing over her bed in the dark, watching her sleep. She said her first thought was that she was still dreaming. Her second thought was that she needed to scream. She ran to her mother's room. "Mom, there's somebody in the house." Angela was awake and moving before the sentence was finished. She got both girls into her room, locked the door, and called 911. Police arrived within 6 minutes. The boy was gone. But the cameras had his face. He was 14 years old. He was identified through a tip from someone who recognized him in the footage. He was arrested and charged with aggravated burglary. His name was not released because of his age. In the days that followed, Angela spoke to local media about the incident. She was composed and devastatingly clear. "The camera is the only reason we know what happened. Without it, we would have woken up the next morning and never known a stranger had been in our home. Never known someone stood over my daughter for 4 minutes. That thought is almost worse than knowing." She installed additional locks on every door and window in the house the following weekend. She also installed a camera in every room. Zoe, for her part, still sleeps with the light on. The man at the window. Every single night, there's a category of crime that doesn't always register as a crime, even to the people experiencing it. It lives in the space between frightening and illegal, in the gray area where law enforcement can sometimes shrug and say, "We can't do anything until he actually does something." This is a story about that gray area. and about how terrifying it can be to live inside it. In the fall of 2021, a woman living alone in a mid-rise apartment complex in Denver, Colorado, noticed something on her outdoor camera footage that made her stomach drop. A man she didn't recognize had been standing in the hallway outside her door the night before, not knocking, not waiting for a neighbor, just standing there, facing her door, for almost 40 minutes. She checked the footage from earlier in the week. He'd been there Monday night, Wednesday night, the Friday before that. Every single night for at least a month, this man had been standing outside her door for extended periods, sometimes 30 minutes, sometimes over an hour, and just watching. At points in the footage, you could see his lips moving slightly, but the audio caught nothing intelligible. She reported it to police. They told her essentially that standing in a hallway wasn't illegal, and unless he made a direct threat or attempted to enter her home, there wasn't much they could do. She reported it again and again. Each time the response was some variation of the same bureaucratic shrug. Eventually out of options and increasingly frightened to come home at night, she posted several clips to her social media. The response was immediate and overwhelming, not just support, but hundreds of messages from women who said they had experienced something similar and felt equally powerless to stop it. The video went viral within 48 hours. The combination of public attention and the viral spread of the footage finally got her building management to respond. Security was increased. The man was identified as someone who lived on another floor of the building. He was issued a no-contact order and removed from the complex. Whether charges were filed is unclear. She stopped posting publicly about the situation shortly after, and her profile went private. But the story resonated with hundreds of thousands of people because it touched on something that's very hard to legislate: the specific terror of being watched by someone who has decided, for reasons you'll never understand, that you are interesting to them. The tricks they use when danger wears a disguise. Here's something that true crime researchers and law enforcement professionals will tell you, and that most people don't want to hear. The most dangerous situations aren't always the most obvious ones. The man in the ski mask is terrifying, yes. The men trying to pull the door open are frightening, but those situations give you something concrete to respond to. Your body knows what to do with an obvious threat. Your adrenaline kicks in. You run. You lock the door. You call 911. What your body doesn't know how to respond to is ambiguity, confusion. The situation that looks like one thing but is another. The situation designed, deliberately and specifically, to make you lower your guard. This next story is about exactly that. The woman at the door. Nothing is what it seems. It was a Wednesday night in late October in a quiet neighborhood in El Paso, Texas. The temperature had dropped after sunset, and the street was empty except for the occasional passing car. The resident, whose outdoor camera captured what followed, had already gone to bed. At 11:43 p.m., a woman appeared at the edge of the driveway. She was crying. At first glance, and the camera is clear enough to make first glances meaningful, she appeared to be in genuine distress. Her body language was unmistakable. Hunched shoulders, hands wrapped around herself, the kind of physical collapse that looks like someone who has been through something terrible and needs help desperately. She walked toward the front door, and for a moment, everything about the scene seemed straightforward. A woman in trouble, a door, a potential lifeline. But then something odd happened. A car turned onto the street, its headlights sweeping over the front of the house, and the woman dropped. Not tripped, not stumbled, She flattened herself against the side of the porch, pressing into the shadows, waiting until the car passed before she rose again. Watch that behavior carefully, because it tells you everything. A woman who is genuinely frightened, who is fleeing someone, who needs help, who is in danger, does not hide from passing cars. Passing cars are potential rescuers. They're witnesses. They're lifelines. If anything, a person in real distress would run toward a passing car, wave it down, scream for it to stop. Unless, of course, she wasn't trying to be seen. The crying and distress continued on and off for the next several minutes as she periodically approached the door and then retreated. At one point, the motion-triggered driveway light snapped on, and she flinched. Not in the way a frightened person flinches at an unexpected light. In the way a person flinches when they realize they've been suddenly visible. Then, about 14 minutes into the footage, a car appeared from around the corner. She immediately stopped crying, walked calmly to the curb, got in. The neighbor who reviewed the footage the next morning posted it online with a question. Is this woman in danger or is something else going on? The internet was split. Then, approximately 5 weeks later, El Paso police announced the arrest of a woman named Krista Nicole Cordeaux on charges of burglary of habitation, defined under Texas law as unlawfully entering a residence with the intent to commit an additional crime inside, including theft, assault, or property destruction. When the mugshot was released alongside the announcement, multiple people who had seen the original video made the connection immediately. The resemblance, bone structure, hair, the curve of her face, was striking enough that the original post and the booking photo were being compared side by side across several major online forums within hours. Now, suddenly, everything in that 14-minute clip reads differently. The crying wasn't distress. It was a performance, a carefully calibrated act designed to trigger the most powerful instinct most people have, the instinct to help someone who appears to be suffering. Most of us, if we'd been awake and heard crying on our porch, would have opened the door without thinking twice. We'd have opened it quickly, the way you do when someone needs help. And that's exactly what she was counting on. The hiding from passing cars wasn't paranoia. It was operational. She didn't want witnesses to a casing operation. She didn't want anyone to remember a crying woman on this particular street on this particular night. Not until her job was done. And the car that came to collect her? That's what got her in trouble. Because that car, the timing of it, the calmness of her departure, it told investigators that she wasn't working alone. The full scope of what she and whoever was with her intended to do that night was never publicly confirmed. But the charge of burglary of habitation carries a minimum sentence of 2 years in Texas, and the maximum is 20. The anatomy of the Distress Act, how to recognize it. Law enforcement officials and victim advocates who work with home security footage have identified a pattern that shows up with disturbing regularity in cases like Krista Cordeaux's, what some investigators informally call the Distress Act. Understanding how it works is the first step in protecting yourself against it. The Distress Act relies on a simple, devastating truth about human psychology. We are hardwired to respond to visible suffering. The instinct to help is not a weakness. It is one of the most beautiful things about human beings. But it is also an instinct that can be exploited. Here's what to look for. Crying or apparent emotional distress that seems disconnected from the environment. A genuinely distressed person's emotion intensifies when they make contact with potential help. If someone approaches your door crying but their effect seems oddly controlled, almost performative, that's worth noting. Avoidance of visibility or witnesses. As described above, a person in real danger moves toward lights, toward other people, toward anything that might help them. If someone at your door seems to be hiding from passing traffic or neighbors, the calculus has changed. Odd calm when the apparent threat appears to have passed. Genuine trauma doesn't turn off like a faucet. If someone has been displaying desperate distress and then abruptly becomes calm and composed, especially when a vehicle arrives, that transition is meaningful. Delay tactics. The goal is to keep you at the door, or ideally to get you to open it, long enough to complete whatever the actual objective is. This can take the form of extended storytelling, urgent requests that require you to search your house for something, or simply sustained emotional pressure that makes you feel guilty for not opening the door. The rule that every security professional will give you is this: you can help someone without opening your door. You can call 911 on their behalf. You can pass a phone through a cracked door with the chain on. You can stay on the line with them while you wait for police. You do not have to open your door to be a good person. Remember that. What the cameras taught us: staying safe in the age of surveillance. We've spent the last 3 sections looking at what cameras captured. But let's take a step back for a moment and talk about what all of this footage, the scary stuff, the ambiguous stuff, the outright terrifying stuff, has actually taught us about staying safe. Because that's ultimately what this is about. Not fear for fear's sake, not voyeurism, but the hard-won, camera-documented understanding of how these situations develop and how they can be stopped. The pattern you need to see. If you watch enough home security footage, and researchers who study burglary and home invasion have watched thousands of hours of it, you start to notice patterns. The same behaviors show up again and again, across different states, different demographics, different types of homes. Here are the patterns that matter most. Pattern 1. The casing pass. In the overwhelming majority of home invasion cases where security footage was available, investigators found that the perpetrator had made at least 1, and often 2 or 3, passes by the home before the actual incident, not during the day when activity is normal, but in the evening or early morning hours when they could assess lighting, camera positions, whether dogs were present, and when residents typically came and went. The takeaway. A car that drives by your house multiple times in an evening is worth noting. A person who walks past your house slowly, looking at it, and then comes back from the other direction 15 minutes later is worth noting. Install your cameras to capture the street as well as the porch. Pattern 2. The timing. The vast majority of opportunistic home intrusions happen in a narrow window, between 11 p.m. and 3 a.m. This is when most people are deepest in sleep, when the neighborhood is quietest, and when the odds of a random passerby witnessing something are lowest. This doesn't mean you're safe at other hours. Donna's story happened in broad daylight. But it does mean that the moment you lie down for the night is precisely when your defenses need to be their most automated. Locked doors, active cameras, motion sensor lights. These things matter most between midnight and sunrise. Pattern 3. The door. You would be stunned, genuinely, deeply stunned, by how many home intrusions in security footage simply involve someone walking through an unlocked front door. No forced entry, no broken windows, no sophisticated technique. Just a door that someone forgot to lock, or that was left on the latch instead of the deadbolt. In the Wichita case with Zoe and the teenage intruder, investigators believe this is exactly what happened. The boy didn't pick the lock. He didn't break in through a window. He tried the front door, found it unlocked, and walked through. 4 minutes later, he was standing over a sleeping 15-year-old girl. Lock your door. Every time. Without exception. This is the single highest impact security habit you can build, and it costs nothing. What cameras can and can't do. The footage in this compilation has done remarkable things. It identified a rapist targeting women in Charlotte. It helped convict an armed robbery suspect in Tacoma. It caught the face of a teenage boy who stood over a sleeping child. It gave a woman in Denver the evidence she needed to force her building management to act. Cameras save lives. The evidence for this is overwhelming and growing, but cameras have limits. And understanding those limits is as important as understanding their power. Cameras document. They don't prevent. This is the hardest truth about home security footage. The camera doesn't stop the man from following you up the driveway. It doesn't lock the door when you forget. It doesn't intervene when someone is standing outside your door for 40 consecutive nights. What it does is create a record. And that record can be used after the fact in ways that are genuinely powerful. For prosecution, for identification, for building a legal case that leads to arrest and conviction. But the documentation happens after the terrifying thing has already occurred. This is not an argument against cameras. It's an argument for understanding them correctly. What you actually need is a system. The security professionals who have spent years working with law enforcement on residential safety cases talk about a layered approach, not any single device or habit, but multiple overlapping layers of protection that work together. Layer 1 is awareness, the habit of scanning your environment, looking behind you before you open your door, taking a second before you enter your home to verify you haven't been followed. It costs nothing, and it has stopped more crimes than any device ever invented. Layer 2 is deterrence, visible cameras, motion-activated lights, a deadbolt on the front door, a door reinforcement plate over the strike zone. Most opportunistic criminals don't want to fight. They want an easy target. Make your home clearly not that. Layer 3 is documentation, the cameras themselves. Positioned correctly, covering all entry points, recording continuously, and backing up to cloud storage so that if a device is physically destroyed, as Marcus and Renee's was, the footage survives anyway. Layer 4 is response, knowing what to do when something happens. Having 911 memorized. Having a safe room with a locked door where you can get your family while you call for help. Having a plan that your household has actually talked about, not just assumed. The families in these stories who came out okay, Dana, Marcus and Renee, Angela and her daughters, they each had at least one of these layers working for them at the critical moment. Dana had a door that locked before the man reached it. Marcus and Renee had a camera that survived just long enough to capture the suspect's face. Angela had a locked bedroom door and the presence of mind to get her children to safety before calling for help. None of them had a perfect system, but each of them had something. One layer, one safeguard, one decision made correctly. And that was enough. The conversation we all need to have. There's one more thing that the cumulative weight of this footage makes impossible to ignore. We live in a moment when the tools for home security have never been more accessible, more powerful, or more affordable. Cameras that would have cost thousands of dollars 10 years ago now cost $35. Motion-activated lights are solar-powered and require no installation. Smart locks can be controlled from your phone. The technology is there, but technology without habit is just expensive furniture. The families who are truly protected are the ones who have had the conversation, the uncomfortable, slightly paranoid feeling conversation about what to do if something goes wrong. The what if conversation. The here's our plan conversation. The check your camera footage regularly, not just when something feels wrong conversation. Most of us don't want to have that conversation because having it means acknowledging that something could go wrong. And acknowledging that something could go wrong means accepting that we are not as safe as we feel. But here's the thing. Feeling safe and being safe are not the same thing. Dana felt safe walking up her driveway in the afternoon. Angela felt safe leaving the front door unlocked in a neighborhood she lived in for years. The student in Columbus felt safe on the 30-second walk from her car to her door. The camera footage tells a different story. Not to paralyze you, not to make you afraid to leave your house, but to make the case, a clear, documented, incontrovertible case, that the gap between this could never happen to me and this almost happened to me is sometimes just a matter of which way a door lock turns. Turn it. Every time. Look behind you. Check your footage. Have the conversation, because the camera sees everything. And what it sees, more often than we'd like to admit, is how close we all came. What these cameras gave back. Here's how each of these stories ultimately ended. Or rather, here's what the cameras gave back to the people in them. Dana got an arrest warrant. Not a conviction, not yet, but a case file. And she got the awareness that changed how she moves through the world. The second of hesitation before she opens her door that might, someday, save her life again. Marcus and Renee got justice. 2 convictions, 2 men off the street, and the particular peace of knowing that their victimization didn't just vanish into the night. Jake got something harder to name. Maybe just the knowledge that he wasn't imagining things. Maybe that's enough. Zoe and Angela got safety, immediate, documented, actionable safety. A face on a screen became a name and a file became a boy in front of a judge. The system worked, imperfectly and slowly, but it worked. The woman in Denver got her building to act. Her building might not have acted without the footage going viral. Without hundreds of thousands of people watching and saying, "This is not okay," loudly enough that someone with authority finally had to agree. And the person who almost opened their door to Krista Nicole Cordeaux on that October night in El Paso got to sleep in their bed without knowing how close they came. The camera saw it. The internet connected the dots. Justice was served. That's what these cameras gave back. That's what staying alert, staying aware, and staying locked gives back. Keep your doors locked. Check your footage. Look behind you. The camera is watching. And make sure you are too.